Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my little fight preview, my fight breakdown, and my fight prediction of the very interesting fight I believe that's going to happen on that of PBC, or wherever overall this fight ends up happening, but I believe it's on that of the PBC, because I think that both of these fighters are with that of Premier Boxing Champions, but we'll see what happens with that. Anyways, the fight overall that I'm going to be breaking down today or doing a video on is that of the Tim Tszyu versus Tony Harrison fight. And for some of you overall that are wondering when some of my other fight analyzations are going to be coming in, or some of my other fight predictions or videos about, say, the Caleb Plant versus David Benavidez fight, or the Naoya Inoue versus that of the Steve Von Fulton fight, let me also say something about the Inoue versus Steve Von Fulton fight. Because there are certain people overall that tell me all the time that I don't watch overall enough of either fighter, or that I certainly don't watch that enough of Inoue, and that I really underestimate his abilities. Well, I don't think that I'm really underestimating his abilities, at least in my view. I just think all in all that in my view that Steve Von Fulton, at least for me, would be the favorite. Now, certain people did make the point in the comment section that Inoue right now is the favorite by the Vegas odds makers. Well, just because someone is the favorite by the Vegas odds makers does not always mean that they're going to win the fight. And if you've been around boxing long enough, you know that. It just is what it is. But anyways, when it comes down to it all in all, we'll talk about that later, because I do have more analyzations to do, and I do need more of a sample work, I will admit, about both Mr. Naoya Inoue and Steve Von Fulton. I'm just giving you that based off of a small sample size of what I've watched, based off of a few fights overall of Steve Von Fulton that I've seen, and that of Mr. Inoue. Mr. Naoya Inoue, I believe is his name, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So that full-on analyzation is going to come on later, of course, when that fight officially happens, and I believe that that fight happens on May 7th. As for the Caleb Plant versus David Benavidez fight, I'm going to do that one probably about when it's going to happen during that week. I believe that it happens March 25th overall when it comes down to it this month. So that fight prediction is going to happen the week overall of that fight. I don't believe that it happens next week overall or within the next couple weeks, but I think it happens within the final week. So we'll see overall what ends up happening with that. And then, of course, there's other fights as well. But this really truly has been so far a great year in boxing. There's been a great amount of fights that have been announced. And even though this fight is not really against two fighters that, in my opinion, are really top 10 pound for pound fighters in terms of accomplishments or skills, in my opinion, it is going to be a very particularly interesting one. And the reason why I say that is because even though at one point in time I thought that this fight was going to be somewhat straightforward, I'm not really going to say, well, let me not say that. I'm not really going to say that I ever thought that this fight was 100% straightforward. But after taking a look at it a little bit more and doing my full in-depth analyzation, at least to the best of my ability, this truly is going to be a very particularly interesting fight. And the reason why I say that is because this is really going to be a clashing of the styles. And like people always say, styles make fights. Tim Tszyu, at least from what I see of him, he tends to be a lot like his father, at least with the type of style that he tries to portray, which is pretty much that pressure fighter that is mainly overall going to try to incrementally break you down throughout the whole entire fight. Now, I never did watch that much of Kostya Tszyu, who of course was his father, who completely unified that of the 140-pound division back in the day. I believe either the late 90s or the early 2000s was when he did that. But mainly from what I've seen of him, he was usually a fighter that tried to break you down over time, and Tim Tszyu is usually going to do that. I've seen his last fight against that of Terrell Gachet. He did have a little bit of an issue. Of course, he ended up getting knocked down within that of round one. And of course, there is certain problems that Tim Tszyu has that Tony Harrison might be able to take advantage of. But Tim Tszyu, all in all, one thing I'll give him credit for is this. He got back up after that first round, and pretty much ever since that moment on, he got defensively better. I thought that he all around got better throughout that fight, and he pretty much dominated the rest of that fight. I don't believe he ever got knocked down again in that fight. When it came down to it, I believe that he did knock down his opponent, Terrell Gachet, and he was decently dominant. Now, once again, he does have holes in his game. And if we're going to talk about Tim Tszyu, he's a decent pressure fighter, but if we're going to talk about his faults, his footwork is a little bit clunky, especially with the way overall that he does walk around sometimes. He does cross his legs at times, which can, mess up your balance a little bit. overall, and I'm not the only one that has mentioned that. There's been other videos or YouTube channels to mention that as well. Sometimes I think he can be a little bit too stiff. He is not great at avoiding a jab. He does need to get better at that when it comes down to it. And what I will say is this, I'm not necessarily sure if he's ever been in a fight to where if the fighter really takes the fight to him, how he's really going to react. Now, some of you may say, what are you talking about? Tim Tszyu is a guy that likes to incrementally break down his opponents. Right, but some of these pressure fighters overall, like a Mike Tyson or a Gennady Golovkin or a Deontay Wilder, they really like to try to break down their opponents. And when people actually try to fight with them on the inside, so many people overall say, what are you doing? Why are you trying to fight with them on the inside? But sometimes it actually helps the matter overall than what it does make it worse. Because a lot of the times you can clinch with them overall, suffocating their inside attack. Now, some of the times, if you have a fighter like that of a Tyson Fury or an Andre Ward, or Floyd Mayweather Jr., who knows how to fight very well within the clinch, sometimes that can be a disadvantage for you. And Tim Tszyu, overall, he does appear to somewhat fight decently within the clinch, so that is going to be very interesting to see how Tony Harrison reacts to that. But overall, what I will say is this, it is going to be very interesting to see how Tim Tszyu does react if Tony Harrison does truly take the fight to him. And you never really truly know 100% how Tony Harrison is going to fight, in my view. More than likely what he is going to do, because what he usually does is try to fight more than likely on the back foot, try to use that very decent and slick and sharp jab that he has and try to box around him more than all, try to use that lead hand, try to use feints, overall try to move around him and use different angles. And I think that, in my opinion, that pretty much is the best game plan that Tony Harrison can more than likely have against that of Tim Tszyu. I think that he's probably going to want to try to fight this fight more than likely in the middle of the ring or on the back foot. He has to make sure that Tim Tszyu is not pressuring him, at least to the point to where he is overly effective, to the point to where he is outlanding him and that he's gaining a great amount of confidence. Tony Harrison, at times in this fight, even when he's a little bit uncomfortable, he is going to have to overall throw down with that of Tim Tszyu. He is going to have to stand his ground, just like what he did with Jermell Charlo overall and a couple of other fighters in his career. He is going to have to do that, even sometimes at possibly being risked of knocked out, because if he lets Tim Tszyu pretty much be on the front track the whole entire time and pressure him the whole entire time, I'm not quite sure if it's going to end up super well for Tony Harrison. But what I will say is this, Tony Harrison does have certain skills, in my opinion, overall, to where he can certainly take advantage of some of the deficiencies of Mr. Tim Tszyu. He has a great jab. Like I said, Tim Tszyu was not always great at avoiding a jab. I think that Tony Harrison more than likely has the better feet. He moves around better, and I think that he knows how to use his feet a little bit better. But the problem with Tony Harrison always is this. You never know after a while how hittable he's going to be, and he does appear to certainly have certain anxiety issues. And there's just certain fighters that were always like that. There were certain fighters that once overall they really started winning a fight that they were probably not expected to win, that it was just too much pressure for them. And there are certain athletes that are just potentially like that. Matt Ryan was another athlete that was like that, the quarterback overall for the Atlanta Falcons for a big majority of his career. That's why Matt Ryan had two of the biggest blown leads within that of NFL history. There are just certain athletes that are like that. They perform very, very well when they're not really expected to do much. But once they actually start winning that fight, they're like, wow, I'm actually pulling this off. And then, their own mind gets to them, their own pressure, their own anxieties get to them. Tony Harrison is one of those fighters. He just makes too many mistakes, especially later on down the line, and it usually, at least in his bigger fights, results in him getting stopped or getting knocked out. His defense does need to be a little bit better. There are certain times to where Tony Harrison overall, his defense is very, very good, and then there's other times to where it's very inadequate. I recently watched overall the fight against that of Jermell Charlo, a very interesting fight, by the way. For those of you overall that have not seen it, a very close and interesting fight. A lot of Jermell Charlo fans, of course, would debate that, Jermell Charlo got robbed in that fight. I would not debate that. I would say that, in my opinion, that Jermell Charlo probably just lost the fight, or that, at the best, it could have went, potentially either way. But Tony Harrison fought, in my opinion, a very beautiful fight. Also, by the way, one of the worst commentated fights that I've ever heard by Lennox Lewis and Joe Goosen and that PBC team. The commentary was absolutely awful and very, very biased. But when it came down to it all in all, once again, not to digress too much or not to really go besides the point, Tony Harrison can do certain things in the ring to where he can take advantage of Tim Tszyu's deficiencies. But one thing that I like about Tim Tszyu over Tony Harrison is that when he ended up getting knocked down over that of Terrell Gausha, he had a lot of dog in him. He showed me overall that he was going to get back up on that horse. He was overall going to utilize somewhat of a decent jab, go to the body when it came down to it, and overall utilize certain pull counters, move his head a little bit better. He's never going to be someone that is, once again, a Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's never going to be that graceful in the ring. I don't think his father ever was either. His father also was a little bit too stiff, in my opinion, and not always the most defensively responsible. You can see that in the Zab Judah fight and in a couple of other fights, but he does enough to get the job done, especially possibly against a fighter like that of a Tony Harrison. Like I said, Tony Harrison at times in certain fights, his defense is very good at times, like in that first Jermell Charlo fight, and then there's other times to where it's very inadequate. Like if you took a look at one of his last fights against a guy I believe named Perella, or whatever the hell his name was, and even against that of the last guy I think he fought, Sergio Garcia, who is a guy that allegedly gave a very tough fight to that of, what the hell is his name? Sebastian Fundora. You know, the basically the tower overall of the 154-pound weight division. Apparently, there's a lot of people that believe that Sergio Garcia could have potentially won that fight. I can't tell you that because I never watched the full fight. But I did watch certain bits and pieces. Sergio Garcia seemed to give Fundora a tough time here and there. And then, of course, against Tony Harrison, he was able to hit him when it came down to it. But mainly, overall, Tony Harrison was able to use his jab, his right cross, which is also very good. He was able to utilize his movement, and he was able to utilize his superior boxing skills from what I've seen to dominate the fight, even though he still got hit a little bit too much for my liking. Tony Harrison, once again, he's a very decent boxer in certain regards, but there are certain times to where his head does not move off the line enough when it comes down to it. His chin is not very good. In my opinion, it's not the weakest that I've seen, but it is something overall to worry about. And on top of that, once again, he has very bad anxiety issues. And ever since overall that Jermell Charlo loss, he seems even more hittable than what he was in prior fights. If you take a look at him against that one dude that was like 17-3, Perella or whatever the hell his name was, when it came down to it, he got hit a lot in that fight. So much to the point overall to where it was scored a draw because they couldn't really decide a winner in that fight. And there was probably certain people that I'm guessing overall, I can't really tell you because I didn't watch the full fight. There are certain people that probably believe that Tony Harrison probably did not even deserve to win that fight. And even against Sergio Garcia, what I noticed is that his hands seem to be down a little bit more. He seems to be exchanging a little bit more, but Tony Harrison doesn't seem to have the gift overall to be able to hit and overall not get hit in return, at least to the greatest of degrees. Not to the degree of what a Floyd Mayweather Jr. can do, not to the degree of what a Canelo Alvarez can do, or some of the best boxers out there. Terrence Bud Crawford, Tyson Fury, whoever the hell else you want to mention. Tony Harrison just doesn't seem to have that, and in certain exchanges, he will get hit when it comes down to it, even if he's able to land a very decent punch. If it comes to a 50-50 exchange, which Tim Tszyu, in my opinion, more than likely will not be afraid of when it comes down to it, I do have to give the advantage to Tim Tszyu. And the reason why I say that overall once again is because Tony Harrison has been knocked out 3 separate times in his career. He's a guy that is even more hittable, in my opinion, at this point in his career than what he was even a few years ago. At that point in time, he still looks somewhat defensively responsible. Tony Harrison, in my opinion, his defense within his last couple of fights, it really has been subpar, even compared to some of his standards before. And there's been times, once again, to where his defense has looked very, very good, but then there's been other times to where it's been very inadequate. Is he going to have a defensive master plan in this game, in this, fight, or is he going to be a little bit too hittable? We'll see what happens. He could potentially take Tim Tszyu a little bit more seriously. Maybe that was the problem. I'm not sure if I'm really believing that, because Tony Harrison, in my opinion, was always a little bit too hittable, and on top of that, he was getting hit with certain punches that I could tell, at least in my view, that more than likely he was not planning to get hit by. Once again, I think that he wants to exchange a little bit more and sit down on his punches with certain fighters, and that's great, but you also have to be somewhat defensively responsible. And Tony Harrison was not gifted with a great chin. He reminds me a lot of Zab Judah, and Zab Judah, in my opinion, certain people said that he had a weak chin. In my opinion, Zab Judah really didn't have a weak chin, at least a super weak chin. He just ended up crumbling pretty much after the 4 or 5 rounds against elite fighters because, once again, kind of like Tony Harrison, he always had those anxiety issues. So he always had flameouts. Once again, there are just certain athletes like that to where they cannot handle that pressure. They cannot handle that pressure to being above in a game over a Tom Brady or overall winning a certain fight that they probably should potentially win. They overall just can't handle that. And Tony Harrison is one of those fighters. That's why he's only ever won one title in his career, and he put on a very good performance. But of course, like I predicted, he ended up getting stopped within that of the rematch. So once again, this fight is going to be very particularly interesting because Tim Tszyu is still somewhat relatively inexperienced, especially against that of the high grade level competition. And one thing I will say is this: Tony Harrison, not only can he utilize certain weapons and tools that he has in his arsenal, depending on what version of him shows up, but on top of that, he's a decent amount taller. And on top of that, he has about a 6-inch reach advantage over that of Tim Tszyu. So if he pulls out the perfect game plan, he truly could potentially win this fight. He could potentially possibly even stop Tim Tszyu, but all this is based off of a lot of what ifs, and that's really the problem. And I can't really base my predictions off that of what ifs. Tony Harrison is one of those fighters to where you always really hope that he pulls it together because you can see that there's certain boxing potential that he has. In my opinion, he even has more boxing potential than other certain boxers that had more hype behind him, like that of an Adrian Broner. There are certain things that Tony Harrison, in my opinion, can do that Adrian Broner actually cannot do. But Tony Harrison, because of the anxiety issues that he has when it comes down to it, and with him not handling pressure very well, and on top of that, with him not having a great chin and getting hit way too often, you just never really know when he's really going to pull it together and when he's really going to put on his best performance. And what the past has showed is that whenever Tony Harrison was expected to put on a decent showing, he usually always failed in that performance. It just is what it is. That's what it showed. The only time he was ever successful was in a fight that he was never expected to win in the first place. Ironically, when he had not a lot of pressure on him. And certain people may say, overall, what are you talking about? Not a lot of pressure on him. Nobody expected Tony Harrison to win that fight against Jermell Charlo. Nobody. And ironically, once again, the only fight that he's ever won, that was a big fight in his career. So who do I personally believe is going to win the fight? Well, it's a fight that truly could go either way. Once again, in my opinion, Tony Harrison is best off trying to box around Tim Tszyu, trying to use that very crisp jab, sticking that lead hand in his face, go to the body. Tony Harrison a lot of the times does not go to the body enough. That's one of the weaknesses also that I see about a little bit of his game planning. He's a very decent boxer when he needs to be or when he wants to be. When it comes down to it, you need to use angles, you need to half step, you need to use lateral movement, and your head needs to go off center. A lot of the times Tony Harrison gets hit way, way, way too much because his head movement a lot of the times, at least compared to what it needs to be, it's not up to adequacy. It's not really up to par. So he needs to move his head a little bit more. His defense also needs to be very good in this fight. Because, Tim Tszyu, he's not really someone that is a one-shot knockout guy, but he is a guy that has enough power to possibly hurt you. And as we've seen with Tony Harrison, he's a guy that could certainly potentially be knocked down overall in a fight. And that's also another factor that's going to be interesting. Because Tim Tszyu, there might be certain people that are predicting him to knock out Tony Harrison. But Tim Tszyu is not necessarily what I would call a one-shot knockout guy. Now, he does have about 15 knockouts, I believe, within about 20 or 21 fights. But he's not a guy like Jermell Charlo or Brian Castano, in my opinion, to where he has around that same level of power. So it's also going to be very interesting to see whose power affects who a little bit more. Because Tony Harrison has decent power, and he can hit you with very good counters on the front foot or on the back foot. Once again, it's just going to depend on how much he wears down and if his confidence overall will remain throughout the rest of the fight. And one thing I'll give Tony Harrison is this. He did give Sergio Garcia a tough fight. Of course, Sergio Garcia, he's not really a guy that I would ever see as a true, A-grade fighter or a true top contender. But he did give Sebastian Fundora his problems. And the fact that Tony Harrison was able overall to recover from certain troubles or at least getting hit, and the fact that he was able to dominate that fight from what I've seen, I have to give him a little bit of that credit. However, Tim Tszyu is the undefeated fighter here. And Tim Tszyu does have a type of style to where I think he gets better as the fight goes along. Tony Harrison, a lot of the times in his biggest fights, he gets a little bit worse as the fight goes along. So I'm going to say this. I wouldn't really be shocked with whoever wins this fight. A lot of people are favoring Tony Harrison. I'm going to favor that of Tim Tszyu. And I understand why a lot of people are favoring Tony Harrison. I think if he utilizes a body attack, I think if he utilizes that crisp jab and overall keeps Tim Tszyu in the middle of the ring and really shows his power early and uses that right cross when it comes down to it and is adequate defensively, he certainly could win this fight. He could win this fight probably about 8 rounds to 4 or somewhere around there. I just don't believe that he's going to. And the reason why is because too many times I've seen Tony Harrison just get hit way, way, way too often. Too many times, all in all, when it comes down to it, I've not seen a consistent body attack. And too many times, I've just seen his anxiety issues and the pressure be on his shoulders way too much for him. I'm going to go with Tim Tszyu by decision. I would not be shocked if it was a knockout loss for that of Tony Harrison once again. I have to go with Tim Tszyu here. Once again, if you're going to Tony Harrison, I have no problem. This is truly a 50-50 fight. It is a coin toss fight depending on who utilizes their weapons more. And as for Tim Tszyu, in my opinion, you really have to try to pressure Tony Harrison. And Tony Harrison, at times, even though he does have that very good jab, a lot of the times he does not keep his hands overall back to his face. He did a little bit in the Jermell Charlo fight decently well in the first fight around and in the rematch. But almost in every other fight, he doesn't appear to, at least over from what I've seen, especially in his most recent fights. So you got to try to get him there. You got to try to hit him with a body attack early when it comes down to it. And when he tries to exchange with you, don't be afraid to throw back. Because when it comes down to it, once again, Tony Harrison, he's a guy all in all that gets hit a lot of the times in certain exchanges because he can't see when certain punches are incoming overall when he's throwing certain exchanges, a lot like a fighter like Amir Khan. That's why he ended up getting knocked out to a certain degree overall when he ended up fighting some of his bigger fights like Danny Garcia or Canelo Alvarez or, some of those other guys. But when it came down to it all in all, once again, or when it comes down to it, this is a very particularly interesting fight. If Tony does utilize his weapons, he certainly can win the fight. I think that his way to win the fight is to use that jab, go to the body with the right cross early and the left hook. Do not be afraid to go to the body. Utilize that lead hand. Use lateral movement. Keep your head off center, even though I don't think that he's very good at that a lot of the times when it comes down to it. And try to keep him in the middle of the ring. There is going to be certain times to where you are going to have to lay down on your punches. You are going to have to show him, you're not just going to bully me throughout the whole entire night. I can hurt you, and I can hit you, and I can do it while going forward. I can do it while going backward. And I'm the guy that has a 6-inch reach advantage. I'm the guy that has a size advantage. You're not just going to bully me throughout the whole entire ring. As for Tim Tszyu, you need to overall bully Tony Harrison in the clinch. In my opinion, overall, you need to utilize a jab to the body and to the head. He usually gets better as the fight goes along. He has very good pull counters, which in my opinion will do very good on the inside because Tony Harrison, a lot of the times, at least in recent fights, he doesn't put his hands up where he needs to be. So overall, Tim Tszyu can get in there. He is going to have to get in there because he's going to have a decent-sized disadvantage in this fight, and he is going to have to get in there. He's going to have to get in there with uppercuts and hooks to the body. He's also going to have to get in there overall with crosses, sometimes overhand rights to Tony Harrison. He's open for that a little bit. With left hooks overall to the head, he's also open with that. He needs to get in there. He needs to utilize his lead hand, utilize the pull counters, create a vicious body attack early on, and then with that overall later on, go to the head a little bit more, and try to progress as the fight goes along. Keep your hands up. Try to move your head also off center when it comes down to it, and don't get caught off balance. That's what Tim Tszyu needs to do. He needs to pressure Tony Harrison the exact time. Tony Harrison, in my view, needs to try to keep the fight in the middle of the ring. And once again, for Tim Tszyu, don't let Tony Harrison bully you in the clinch or overall land certain things in the clinch. You need to take advantage of that. And Tony Harrison especially needs to make sure that Tim Tszyu doesn't bully him in the clinch. Because Tim Tszyu, overall, is a guy that tries to rough you up all in all. So this is going to be a very particularly interesting fight. Who am I going with? I'm going to go with Tim Tszyu by that a decision. Or overall later stoppage. But I'm going to go with decision. Because Tim Tszyu, in my opinion, he's not a guy that is a pure knockout artist, but I am going to go with him in this fight. So we'll see overall what happens. I have Tim Tszyu by that of unanimous or split decision. I'm going to say unanimous decision. Would not be shocked whatsoever if Tony Harrison ended up winning the fight. I would not be surprised if it was dominant on either end. I really wouldn't be. It's one of those type of fights. Very particularly interesting matchup. But that's really about it for my breakdown today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to go with Tim Tszyu, because I believe he's going to be the more confident and the better fighter later on down the line. And I think all in all that is going to do overall him wonders within that fight later on. But we'll see. We'll see. Very, very particularly interesting fight. Great overall contouring of the styles. Very great. But we'll see overall what ends up happening. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.